Hello and welcome to week 9. This week we're going to be focusing on the language and literacy development of infants and toddlers. So for our agenda, we're going to start by going over the focal child assessments, which is part of an assignment that you have due in a few weeks. We're going to then launch into the language and emergent literacy development of infants and toddlers. We're going to see how we can support the literacy development for infants and toddlers. We're going to go over a video activity that you're going to be completing in the discussion forum, and then we're going to review the homework for this week. So starting with the focal child assessments. So the assessments that you're going to complete with your focal child are based on gathering data on their literacy and language development. And they're going to be the results of these assessments are going to be part of the language and literacy development profile, which is an assignment that you have due in a few weeks. So for this assignment, you are going to have a template and an exemplar. And I'm going to advise you to look at both of them, download them, look at them, read them, and see exactly what it is that you're being asked to do. In the descriptions or the directions up here in the template, you're going to have an explanation of what is it that you need to do, how many of each of the components you need to include, and what you're including in this assignment are 3 things. Observations that you have been doing of your focal child. You're going to be putting in information from the family visit that you should have completed already, and you're going to put in the results of the assessments. So in order to know or select which assessments you're going to use, I would recommend you go back to week 6 and you review the PowerPoint presentation, the narrated slides of week 6, and you're going to see all the different kinds of assessments that you're going to be able to use. Here in the description of this assignment, you're going to find examples. So it is going to ask you to include at least 2. So try to complete either 2 or 3 assessments with your focal child, and you can choose from, and these are just examples, you can choose from these. Concepts about print is one type of assessment. You can include work samples that your focal child has completed and you have collected, which can be pictures. It doesn't have to be the original work sample. You can gather information of how the child writes their own name. You can have alphabetic knowledge assessment. You can do a phonological assessment of pronunciation and fluidity of oral language. So all of those are possibilities. Again, you are only going to need at least 2. If you can do 3, that'll give you even more data on your focal child. So for this week, one of the things that you're going to see highlighted in the homework is to start thinking about which assessments you're going to perform on your focal child, and start thinking about when you're going to meet with your focal child in order to do these assessments. When can you meet with the child and complete them, and what do you need to complete them for? Because for some of these you're going to have materials on hand to be able to do the assessments with your focal child. Okay, so let's get into language and emergent literacy development for infants and toddlers. So oral language development, which is something that we've sort of been focusing on up until now, has these 5 knowledge areas that we've been looking at. So we have phonemic knowledge, semantic knowledge, syntactic knowledge, morphemic knowledge, and pragmatic knowledge. And all of these funds of knowledge that the child has developed in their oral language development and through all the experiences that they've had are going to be the foundation for their emergent literacy. Because again, remember, we're talking about infants and toddlers, but the emergent literacy then is going to develop into the actual literacy skills. So the research on emergent literacy with infants and toddlers has focused on 2 specific contexts of interactions between the parent and the child. So researchers are looking at how those interactions, parent-child interactions, occur. And they've been focused on two main areas, which are picture book sharing and explorations of environmental print. So for picture book sharing, what they found through the research is that there are sort of three distinct levels or stages through which the children go. And the first one occurs in early infancy, so from 0 to 7 months of age, in which they noted that the child is just observing the books, the picture books, that the parent or the adult is sharing with them. And there's not much more interaction than just an observation of the picture book. In late infancy, when the child is between 8 and 12 months of age, they start responding. There's a little bit more of an interaction with the book, especially towards that 1 year mark. So what happens here is cognitively, the child has developed object permanency and symbolic thought is beginning to emerge. And what this means is that when a child is, for example, has a book in front of them and they turn the page, having object permanency is going to allow them to know that even if they have turned the page and they can no longer see the illustration on the previous page because it's covered, that illustration is still there. So and you can see that they might go back and check and see if it's still there. And they're always, and of course, every time they do that, they're going to find that the image is still there. So there is this object permanency cognitive ability happening. There's also symbolic thought happening for the child at this age, meaning that they can know that an object can be represented in their mind as a symbol and not as the real object. So they begin to have these independent interactions with books, and they begin to engage a little bit more with the shared picture book. In toddlerhood, which goes from 12 months to 30 months, there is an active participation now with that shared book experience. And they start labeling images that they see in the illustrations. They start making comments about what's happening in the illustrations. They start asking questions about what they see is happening in the story. They start paying attention to print. So they start asking questions about what is this over here that is a different kind of illustration, right? And they start identifying print versus image or picture or illustration. So they have these now, or can have these now completely independent interactions with books. So one of the things that research has shown us is that there are key behaviors that we can look for that are going to be flags pointing to emergent literacy in terms of observing how children interact with books in a book sharing experience with an adult. So we can see that the child now has or can have a shared gaze when they're looking at illustrations to which the adult is pointing to. Their facial expressions can indicate their comprehension, that they understand what's going on. They can also predict what is going to happen in the book. They can attempt to turn the pages on their own or assist in holding the book while they're interacting with the book. They show that they remember, and sometimes they've memorized stories, the content of a story, and they can anticipate and they can predict what's coming next because they know this story. And it happens typically with their favorite books, that they memorize them and they know these stories by heart, so they are able to predict what's coming in the next page before the page has been turned. They use gestures or question-like verbalizations to elicit a response from the adult. So they have sort of a conversation with the adult, or they can have a conversation with the adult about the book. They participate in labeling the objects or the actions that are in the illustrations, and they might ask the parents to give them a label, like asking, what is this? And so what is the name of this? They also indicate that they're listening, and their vocabulary, both receptive and expressive, is being furthered or developed, and that's also a good indication that that emergent literacy is being fostered through a book sharing experience. So the other type of research that has been done is looking at how children interact with environmental print. And when we talk about environmental print, we're talking about anything in the environment that is written and that the child can have access to, can see, can observe. And so we're talking about newspapers, letters, mail, magazines, road signs, business signs, logos, labels, lists, you name it. Anything that is around the child that is in a written format can be considered environmental print. And so you'll see that the child recognizes these symbols, recognizes the images. If they see something that they like, that's their favorite, like the Sesame Street symbol, for example, if they watch this on TV, or if they have books of Sesame Street and they'll see the symbol and they'll recognize and they'll get excited. They know what it means. So they're starting through engaging with environmental print to recognize that symbols and letters are symbols, convey meaning, right? So, and this is really important because ultimately literacy is about producing meaning, conveying meaning, and comprehending or understanding meaning. So from this, they have also looked at the early writing or early literacy attempts that the child can make. And in toddlerhood, the early explorations of writings tend to move from, and these are all like sort of fluid kinds of phases or stages through which the children can go through, right? So, but it moves from making marks on paper that are just random marks that don't necessarily have when they don't necessarily have much control of the writing instrument, to then making random scribbling, which starts to look like something that resembles writing. And then they start purposefully scribbling. So they can write something like, or produce an image like this one over here, that you can see that it's trying to mimic what writing looks like. Although we can't distinguish any letters yet, we can't distinguish any pseudo letters yet, but it's starting, the scribbling seems purposeful because it's trying to mimic what writing looks like. And the funny thing is that they might produce something like this and then look at the adult and ask him, what does it say? What is this? And of course the adult doesn't know because they were not the ones who wrote it, right? Or who scribbled it. But the child doesn't know either. They just know that they're trying to convey meaning, and they know that by doing scribbles that look like someone's writing, that's the intent. There's a meaning behind that. So they want to ask the adults to provide them with the meaning, which is very fun to experience. Okay, so we're going to see that because infants and toddlers typically are home with their families most of the time, the family's role is going to be critical. And so by research findings, they've identified certain characteristics of the home environment that are associated with promoting infants and toddlers' emergent literacy. So they found that These houses that are promoting emergent literacy are houses in which the parent values literacy. So there's appreciation for reading and for writing. Parents use reading and writing in their daily activities in front of the children. So they're modeling reading and writing for them. The parents engage the children in frequent book sharing. So they sit with the children, they bring a book that maybe it's the child's favorite, they read through it, they flip the pages, they let the child engage with and interact with the book. The parents encourage the children's early literacy explorations, so they provide them with materials, they provide them with paper and writing instruments, they provide them with books so that they are encouraging them to explore. The parents respond positively to children's questions, so they don't just brush them aside, but they actually entertain the questions and they answer the questions that the children have. The parents value the children's early attempts to draw or write. So they don't just dismiss it and say, oh no, that's not a word, or that doesn't say anything. They entertain the fact that it could say something, and it does resemble writing, even though it's not conventional writing yet. The parents engage children in frequent conversations. So there's a lot of talk in households that support emergent literacy. The parents are sensitive to their child's developmental level and prior experiences. So they know, they have identified where their child is developmentally and where their child should be. So what's coming next? And because of that, because they know that, then the parents can scaffold and mediate this moving to the next stage of development for the children. And all of these, I want to call this to your attention. In your book, in your 2019 edition of Otto's book, this figure is figure 4.1, and it's on page 42. But I want to call your attention to this because even in the newer edition, she talks about parents. And not every child lives with their parents, right? Or has two parents. So this is any adult. So any adult, any caregiver that is in the child's life with whom the child spends a lot of time with, this is the kind of environment that adult or that caregiver wants to provide in order to be promoting emergent literacy for infants and toddlers. What can teachers do? Well, the main activity that teachers can do to support emergent literacy for infants and toddlers is observe them. And when you're observing the children, you are paying attention to or looking for if they pay attention to others' speech, if they're interested in other people speaking, if they're making eye contact, and if they're sharing references with adults, if they can participate in a conversation by taking turns, if it's a dialogic conversation and not a monologue, right? So if they know that they need to take turns and listen while others speak in conversations, if they provide attention to ongoing events that are around them in the classroom or in their environment, identifying through observations what their level of oral language is. So where are they with their expressive and their receptive language in all the 5 funds of knowledge areas that we've talked about in terms of language. And then what is their home language or their dialect, and how is that influencing and supporting their language development. So one observation sheet that we can use to gauge where that oral communication is in terms of development, you can find this in your 2019 version on page 54, and it's also figure 5.1. And here you'll see that by looking at the attention that they place to adult speech, the eye contact and the shared reference, the turn taking and the participation in dialogic kinds of conversations, the attention to ongoing events and the level of language and the home and the use of home language, is all going to give you clues as to how that child communicates and what is sort of their level of oral language development. But if you look closely at this observation sheet, you'll see that your options are to mark if the child does this consistently, occasionally, or not at all, right? Not at this time. And as we've said many times, we can't assess or determine the level of development of a child just by one observation. So you're going to need to observe the child many times to be able to say, well, after 5 or 10 observations, I can say that this child consistently has eye contact and shares reference when interacting with books, or when communicating orally with an adult or with a peer, right? So you have to have several observations to be able to say, okay, this happens on a consistent basis, or no, this only happens occasionally. Sort of like half of the time that I've observed the child is able to do this. Or no, it hasn't. I've never seen this. I've observed the child 15 times and I've never seen this happen. So the child is definitely not there yet. You can't observe that or know that at this time. Okay, so what can we do as teachers? One of the best things that we can do is to create a language and literacy rich environment in our classrooms. So we can make sure that we have a special area for book sharing, or we have a book nook or a little cubby where children can go in and read quietly or interact with books quietly. We can have activities throughout the day that are focused on language and literacy development. That is my dog in the background. So if you hear any shaking, barking, breathing, that's my dog. Okay, you can do offer a lot of opportunities for conversation and talk to the children and ask them open-ended questions to promote them to speak. And that way you can amplify or help amplify their vocabulary. You can offer opportunities for conceptual development through exploration, through looking at different objects and talking about them. You can offer opportunities to engage with all different kinds of materials. And talking about materials, you need to be very intentional in the selection of the materials that you choose for your classroom in terms of durability, in terms of content. Even if we're talking about infant and toddlers, the content and the illustrations in the books that you select is going to be very important. So you have here some examples of cloth books, of books that are made out of plastic that are really good for infants because they tend to put everything in their mouths. And these books are really easy to wash and clean, which you will be able you're going to have to do every day in order to provide clean books that are disinfected for infants to interact with them, because they do tend to put everything in their mouth or just touch them and then put their hands in their mouths. Board books are also really good for infants and for toddlers in particular, because the pages are thicker, and even if they put them in their mouth, or even if they interact with them a little on the rough side, they won't tear, because the pages again are made out of cardboard and they're thicker and more durable. Okay, so observing book sharing. This is another observation sheet that you can use in your 2019 edition of Otto's book. It's on page 68 and the figure is the same, 5.8. You'll see that here you are observing all these abilities or all these skills that have to do with interacting with books. Eye contact, shared reference, turn taking, book handling, memory for the content of the book, attentiveness, affective response. And all of these, again, you're going to have to observe several times in order to use an observation sheet like this, so that you can say if the child is doing it consistently, occasionally, or not at all. So this is actually the activity that we're going to do in the discussion board this week. You're going to use this template and try to ask yourself these questions and mark and see how the child from a video that we're going to watch is doing in relation to each of these skills while she's sharing a book with her adult. So this is the book that you're going to be watching, and again, using the observation sheet to look at the skills that this child is enacting and that you're observing through watching the video. That we're going to complete that in the discussion board. The last observation sheet that I wanted to share with you is this one that's called Observing for Symbol Making. And in your 2019 edition of Otto's book, it's on page 70, and the figure is the same, figure 5.9. And this is going to ask you to look for the child's interest in adult writing, the child's interest in environmental print, the child's interest in graphic expressions, the forms of graphic expression that the child is able to do him or herself, the meaning that the child attributes to those graphic expressions when you ask them, what is this? What did you draw here? What does this mean? And then the symbolic or abstract representation during imaginary play. So there's different scenarios in which you're going to observe the child while using this observation tool. And then you're going to jot down sort of an anecdotal notes what you observed and the date in which you observed it. And doing this in a consistent basis was going to give you sort of a profile of where the child is in terms of the skill of symbol making. Again, this observation sheet can be found in your book on page 70. Okie doke, so that is it for this week. The homework is that you're completing this week is to read chapters 4 and 5 from your Otto book. There is an article by Karen Nemeth that was published in 2020 in Young Children's, which is NACE's Practitioners Journal, and it's about promoting language and literacy for diverse children, or children that don't necessarily speak English as their native language. So this is a short article that I think is going to be useful. Admin Slip 6 is due this week, and then the video activity that we just talked about, you're going to complete that on the discussion board. The last thing I'm asking you to do is to look at the assessments. So go back to week 6, look at the assessments available, select assessments that you think you can do with your focal child, and start making sure that you can schedule meetings with your focal child in order to complete these assessments and sort of brainstorm of how you're going to do that. So start thinking about this. This assignment, again, is not due until a couple weeks from now, but I want you guys to start thinking about this, because at this point, you have the observations that you've been completing. You have the family visit that you've completed. The only thing that's missing for your language and literacy profile are the assessments. So start thinking about the assessments and how you're going to complete those. And that is it for this week. I will see you again soon.